Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're taking a massive step back into what has to be one of the most chaotic, innovative, and literally transformative periods in American history. We're looking at the late 19th century. This was a time when staggering technological leaps fundamentally shifted the U.S. from a nation of independent, scattered farming communities straight into a modern, highly integrated corporate economy. We're going to see how the very blueprints of our modern lives were drawn up by railroads, electricity, and just the relentless march of industrialization. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The Shock of Chicago. Okay, let's dive into this. To really wrap our heads around such a complex historical shift, we need to anchor it in a gritty, ground-level reality. And honestly, there is absolutely no better place to witness that sheer shock of industrialization than Chicago. Back in 1889, the famous British author Rudyard Kipling visited Chicago, and he was struck by this profound mixture of awe and absolute horror. He literally described the city as a huge wilderness packed with 100,000 of these terrible people. He looked around and saw, as he put it, no color in the street and no beauty, only a maze of wire ropes overhead and dirty stone flagging underfoot. But here's the wild part. When he got into a cab, his driver proudly looked out at this chaotic, grimy landscape and boasted that these very things were the proof of progress. Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer velocity of Chicago's population explosion. To put this in perspective, in 1850, Chicago was a modest town, just about 30,000 people. A blip, really. But just 50 years later, at the turn of the 20th century, it had exploded to 1.7 million residents. That is a staggering jump, fueled entirely by massive industrial growth and huge waves of immigration from all over the globe. And right at the heart of this explosive, chaotic growth was a single, bloody, and highly efficient industry. Chicago effectively became America's butcher. Imagine this. A tight cartel of just 5 firms produced a whopping 80% of all the meat bought by American consumers. The whole shebang was centered in the Union Stockyards, which was this massive 1-square-mile zone of pens and slaughterhouses just southwest of the city. Here, animals were processed on mechanized disassembly lines. It was really the ultimate symbol of the era, conquering nature with brutal industrial efficiency just to feed a rapidly expanding nation. Section 2. Railroads build a national market. Now, Chicago obviously didn't operate in a vacuum. Let's zoom out a bit to look at the first massive technological engine that made Chicago's meatpacking dominance, and really the entire industrial era, possible in the first place. We're talking, of course, about the railroads. The unprecedented scale and speed of railroad expansion during this time is honestly hard to overstate. National railroad mileage tripled in the 20 years right after the Civil War, and then it tripled again over the following 4 decades. And keep in mind, this wasn't just some organic free market growth. These massive networks were heavily subsidized by the government, which handed out hundreds of millions of acres of land and millions of dollars in bonds just to lay down these tracks. The impact of all those sprawling networks was absolutely revolutionary. Railroads completely annihilated the geographic barriers that had previously kept American cities so isolated from one another. In fact, they were so massive that they birthed the very first modern large-scale corporations, utilizing the legal innovation of incorporation to protect shareholders. And get this, their complex schedules even required the creation of uniform time zones across the entire country. For the very first time, Americans were experiencing time and space in a completely standardized way. And that whole process brilliantly illustrates how the railroads utterly nationalized the economy. Just look at this new supply chain. Cattle were driven overland from Texas ranches, loaded onto trains at Kansas rail depots, shipped straight into Chicago slaughterhouses, and finally packed into innovative refrigerated rail cars to be delivered to local butchers and national dinner tables. Distant goods were suddenly available everywhere. The nation was, for the first time, fully connected. Section 3. Electricity and the Invention Factory. But, tracks and steam were only half of the story. Let's shift our focus to the second major technological engine of the era, one that literally illuminated the landscape. The pace of technological change back then was so dizzying that the public was ready to believe almost anything. Here's a great example. In 1878, a newspaper ran an April Fool's joke claiming that Thomas Edison had invented a machine that could create 40 different kinds of food and drink out of only dirt, water, and air. It was obviously meant to be ridiculous, but Edison actually received serious inquiries from readers asking when this food machine would hit the market. Startling technological advances were happening so fast that, to everyday people, magic seemed entirely plausible. But of course, Edison wasn't a wizard. He was a brilliant business manager who essentially pioneered commercialized research. At his Menlo Park facility, which he literally called an invention factory, Edison wasn't just a lone genius having random eureka moments. He folded business management and science together, promising his investors this incredible pace of output. As he put it, a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so. And the crazy thing is, he actually delivered on that promise of rapid commercial scale. In 1878, he announces his R&D into electric power. Just a year later, in 1879, he exhibits a fully working system of power generation and light. And by 1882, the Pearl Street Central Station opens in New York, powering a full square mile of downtown Manhattan. He was churning out consistent, world-changing commercial breakthroughs at absolute breakneck speed. So the crucial point here is that electricity fundamentally removed the physical limitations of nature. It wasn't just about being able to read at night. Think about it. Factories were no longer tied to water sources or daylight hours. They could operate anywhere at any hour 24/7. Electric rail cars allowed cities to sprawl outward into suburbs, while electric elevators allowed them to scrape the sky and build upward. The very shape of the human environment was completely rewired. Section 4. The transformation of work. Now we arrive at the profound societal climax of this explainer. Because, well, you can't rewire the physical world without fundamentally rewiring the people living in it, right? Let's look at how these technologies transformed American labor and the American dream itself. Before the Civil War, the American ideal was deeply rooted in economic independence, owning a small farm or maybe a local workshop. But post-war industrialization brought a stark new reality. The vast scale and heavy mechanization of business meant far fewer workers could ever aspire to own their own enterprises. Instead, society fractured into a permanent, wage-earning working class on one side and a brand new tier of bureaucratic middle-class managers on the other. Enter the white-collar bureaucrat. Because these new national corporations were so sprawling and complex, the owners were completely disconnected from the day-to-day operations. They had to hire educated managers to actually run things. So if you work in an office today navigating corporate hierarchies, endless meetings, and administration, well, these 1880s educated bureaucrats are your direct professional ancestors. But we have to acknowledge that this efficiency came at a massive, often very painful human cost. The exact same era that generated incredible productivity and vast new wealth simultaneously birthed massive societal conflicts. Wealth became highly concentrated among just a few tycoons. We saw the rapid growth of vast, crime-ridden, and heavily crowded city slums. There were fierce, sometimes violent battles between capital owners and newly formed labor unions fighting for survival. And out in the countryside, the traditional independent farmer faced near-total economic destruction. Section 5. A Bold New World. Let's move to our final section and see how all of this builds into the world we recognize today. The dust of the 19th century has long settled, but the structures it built are still very much standing. The next time you check your phone to coordinate a meeting across uniform time zones, or buy a national brand of food from the grocery store, or commute to a 9-to-5 wage job managed by a corporate hierarchy, or turn on the lights in a 24/7 city, just remember where it all came from. The basic blueprints of your modern daily life were drafted right here, during this chaotic, deeply transformative era of industrialization. And that leaves us with a really provocative thought, inspired by Rudyard Kipling's uneasy visit to Chicago all those years ago. Look at everything we gained and everything we lost. Is the mere fact of snarling together telegraph wires and getting steam to run along iron tracks truly the proof of progress? Did the incredible wealth and technological marvels justify the steep human and societal cost? It's a heavy question, and one that still echoes in every single new technological revolution we face today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope it leaves you curious to explore even more about the blueprints of our modern world.